What if everything we call the beginning was actually the end? What if the moment we point to as the dawn of human civilization, that pivotal transition from nomadic wandering to settled agriculture, from scattered tribes to organized societies, what if that wasn't a birth but a resurrection? What if we're not looking at humanity's first attempt at civilization, but at its second, rising phoenix-like from ashes we've chosen to forget? Before we begin this descent into time, if you find yourself drawn to the kind of history that refuses to rest quietly in textbooks, the kind that whispers through geological strata and echoes in myths too consistent to dismiss, go ahead and subscribe. Not because algorithms demand it, but because you're someone who listens for what silence has buried. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What part of the world holds you as we explore what the ice once concealed? There's a date that haunts the archaeological record, though few speak of it in those terms. 11,600 years ago, give or take a few centuries. On the surface, it marks the end of the Younger Dryas period, that strange millennium-long return to Ice Age conditions that interrupted the world's warming trend. Science calls it a climate anomaly. Ancient myths call it something else entirely. They call it the fire from the sky, the Great Flood, the time when the world ended and began again. But here's what troubles the careful observer. The timing is too perfect. Too catastrophically, impossibly perfect. Consider what the conventional narrative tells us. For hundreds of thousands of years, anatomically modern humans wandered the earth as hunter-gatherers. We made tools, certainly. We created art, undoubtedly. We survived ice ages and warm periods with remarkable adaptability. But we built nothing permanent. We organized nothing complex. We simply endured millennium after millennium until suddenly, almost as if a switch were flipped, we didn't. Around 11,500 years ago, everything changes. Agriculture appears. Not tentatively, not gradually, but explosively across multiple regions that had no contact with one another. Göbekli Tepe rises in Anatolia, its massive stone pillars carved with sophisticated iconography by people who supposedly had barely progressed beyond chipped flint. The first cities begin forming. Pottery proliferates. Social stratification emerges. Writing develops. It's as if humanity collectively woke from a long sleep and remembered how to build civilizations. The standard explanation is elegant in its simplicity. The climate stabilized after the Younger Dryas ended, creating conditions favorable for agriculture, which led to settled communities, which led to everything else. Cause and effect, neat and linear. Climate change as catalyst. But there's a problem with this story, a fissure that widens the more closely you examine it. The archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that sophisticated settlements existed before the Younger Dryas, that complex societies were already developing when something happened. Something sudden, something catastrophic, something that reset the clock. Göbekli Tepe itself whispers this truth. Dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, just after the Younger Dryas ended, it shouldn't exist according to our models. The effort required to quarry, transport, carve, and erect those megaliths would have demanded not just labor but organization. Social complexity, division of roles, sustained cooperation over generations. These aren't the hallmarks of people just figuring out agriculture. These are the hallmarks of people who already knew how to build. And then there's what Göbekli Tepe's pillars depict. Among the carved animals and abstract symbols, there's something else. Something that archaeologists initially dismissed but can no longer ignore. The site appears to record a cosmic event. Multiple pillars feature what look like comets or meteors. One stone, labeled Pillar 43, shows imagery that some researchers have interpreted as a map of the sky. During a catastrophic impact event, the depiction is specific, disturbingly specific. It shows the constellation Draco, recognizable even after 11,000 years. It shows what appears to be a fragmented comet striking Earth. And it shows the disaster that followed, symbolized by a headless man, interpreted by some as representing massive human casualties. Is it a historical record carved in stone? A warning to future generations? Or merely symbolic imagery assigned meaning by researchers desperate to see patterns? The question would be easier to dismiss if Göbekli Tepe stood alone. But it doesn't. It's part of a global pattern of sites that appear immediately after the Younger Dryas, built by people who shouldn't have had the knowledge or capability to build them, and which often show signs of having been constructed atop or near earlier, even more ancient foundations. Something happened 12,800 years ago when the Younger Dryas began. Something happened again 11,600 years ago when it ended. And between those two dates, the world was transformed in ways that shouldn't have been possible if humans were truly starting from scratch. The geological record has begun revealing its secrets. Ice cores from Greenland show platinum spikes, indicators of cosmic impact, precisely at the Younger Dryas boundary. Nanodiamonds, found only in conditions of extreme heat and pressure, appear in sediment layers from dozens of sites across multiple continents, all dating to the same narrow window. Black mats rich in carbon and magnetic spherules blanket areas that would have been prime habitation zones. This is the signature of impact events. Multiple impacts, most likely from a fragmented comet, striking Earth with enough force to alter the planet's climate, trigger massive wildfires, melt ice sheets, and unleash floods that would have been literally biblical in scale. And here's what makes it unsettling. If those impacts occurred, if they were powerful enough to leave these traces in the geological record, then they were powerful enough to destroy anything humans had built. Anything at all. Imagine a civilization, not necessarily our equal technologically, but sophisticated nonetheless. Permanent settlements, agriculture, social hierarchies, perhaps even early forms of record-keeping. Imagine these communities thriving in coastal regions during the late Pleistocene, when sea levels were 400 feet lower than today, when the continental shelves were dry land, when what we now call the Persian Gulf was a fertile valley, when the Mediterranean coastline extended miles beyond its current boundaries. Now imagine fire from the sky. Not metaphorical fire. Real fire. Fragments of a disintegrating comet, each piece kilometers across, streaking through the atmosphere at tens of kilometers per second. The impacts would have been apocalyptic. Explosions measured in megatons. Thermal radiation incinerating everything within hundreds of kilometers. Blast waves flattening forests and settlements alike. The impacts over ice sheets would have been particularly catastrophic, instantly melting massive volumes of ice, sending walls of water cascading across the landscape. And then the secondary effects. Skies darkened by ejected material and smoke from continental-scale wildfires. Temperatures plummeting. The careful balance of the warming climate disrupted, throwing the world back into Ice Age conditions for another 1,000 years. Coastal regions drowned as meltwaters raised sea levels. Inland areas experiencing rapid ecological collapse. What percentage of humanity would have survived such an event? What percentage of their accumulated knowledge, their infrastructure, their civilization? The conventional view says there was nothing to destroy, that humans were still scattered hunter-gatherers without permanent settlements or complex societies. But what if that's wrong? What if the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but simply evidence that we're looking in the wrong places, or rather, that the right places are now? Underwater, buried under hundreds of feet of sediment, or were so thoroughly destroyed that only the faintest traces remain. This is where the archaeological anomalies become relevant. The sites that don't fit our timeline. The structures that seem too sophisticated. The evidence of quarrying and construction techniques that shouldn't exist for thousands more years. The genetic data showing population bottlenecks precisely when these impacts occurred. The sudden appearance of agriculture and animal domestication in multiple locations simultaneously, as if knowledge that already existed was being reapplied rather than discovered for the first time. And then there are the myths. Gods, we've been told, are figments of imagination. Flood stories are localized phenomena exaggerated in retelling. Tales of fire from the sky are metaphors for lightning storms or volcanic eruptions. Ancient accounts of a previous world that ended in catastrophe are creation mythology, not history. But what if we've been too quick to dismiss these accounts? What if ancient peoples were trying to preserve memory of real events in the only format available to preliterate societies, oral tradition, ritualized into religious narratives that would be repeated generation after generation, ensuring the memory wouldn't die even if the witnesses did? The flood myths alone are staggering in their consistency. Not just the biblical deluge, though that's the most famous in Western culture. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim surviving a world-destroying flood sent by the gods. Hindu texts speak of Manu being warned of coming floods and building a vessel to preserve life. Greek mythology has Deucalion's flood, sent by Zeus to purge humanity. Chinese legends tell of Gun Yu taming the great floods. Native American traditions from multiple tribes describe a world destroyed by water. These aren't vague similarities. They're specific. The flood is global or near global. It's sudden, catastrophic, divinely ordained. A small number of humans survive, often warned in advance. They preserve animals and seeds. Afterward, they must rebuild civilization from remnants. Scholars have traditionally explained these similarities through one of two mechanisms. Either the stories are universal archetypes arising from humanity's psychological structures, or they spread through cultural diffusion as peoples migrated and shared myths. Both explanations conveniently avoid addressing the possibility that these myths might preserve memory of an actual event, an event so traumatic, so species-threatening, that every surviving population preserved the memory. The timeline matches. The Younger Dryas impacts would have caused flooding on an unimaginable scale. The rapid melting of ice sheets would have raised sea levels dramatically, drowning coastal settlements. The impacts into oceans would have generated megatsunamis propagating across entire ocean basins. Glacial lakes, held in check by ice dams, would have burst catastrophically when those dams were destroyed, sending torrents of water across continents. If you were a survivor of such an event, trying to explain to your grandchildren what had happened, trying to ensure they remembered so they could warn their grandchildren in turn, how would you describe it? You'd tell them about the fire that fell from the sky, about the earth shaking, about the waters rising and covering everything, about the darkness that followed, about the cold that returned, about the few who survived and had to start over. You'd tell them the gods were angry, that the old world was corrupt and had to be cleansed, that knowledge was lost that must be regained, that the ancestors once knew great things that we must remember, and your descendants would pass these stories down generation after generation, wrapping them in religious significance to ensure they weren't forgotten, until thousands of years later, people would hear these accounts and dismiss them as primitive mythology, never recognizing them as traumatized. Oral history. The Younger Dryas itself demands closer examination. Climate scientists have long known something strange happened 12,800 years ago. The planet had been warming steadily as the last ice age ended. Ice sheets were retreating. Forests were expanding. Sea levels were rising. Then, abruptly, the warming stopped. In some regions, temperatures plunged by as much as 15 degrees Celsius within a decade, virtually overnight in geological terms. This shouldn't happen. Climate doesn't change that rapidly through normal mechanisms. The standard explanation has been that shifting ocean currents, particularly changes in the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, caused the sudden cooling. Fresh water from melting ice sheets supposedly disrupted the Gulf Stream, plunging the northern hemisphere back into glacial conditions. It's a reasonable hypothesis. It accounts for the evidence, but it has problems. It doesn't fully explain the speed of the change. It doesn't account for the global nature of the event. The Younger Dryas affected not just the North Atlantic region but was felt worldwide. And it doesn't explain why the warming resumed equally abruptly 11,600 years ago, as if a switch were flipped. The impact hypothesis provides an alternative explanation. Multiple comet fragments striking Earth would have injected massive amounts of dust and aerosols into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering a rapid cooling event. The impacts would have caused widespread wildfires, adding smoke to the atmospheric burden. The disruption to ice sheets would have indeed altered ocean currents, creating a feedback loop that prolonged the cooling. Then, approximately 1,200 years later, the atmospheric effects finally cleared. The planet's systems restabilized. Temperatures rebounded quickly because the underlying forcing, orbital parameters favoring warmth, hadn't changed. Only the temporary disruption had prevented the warming from continuing. This explains both the sudden onset and the sudden termination of the Younger Dryas. It explains the global effects. It explains the platinum anomaly, the nanodiamonds, the magnetic spherules, the carbon-rich black mats. It explains the extinctions that occurred at the Younger Dryas boundary, when megafauna that had survived previous climate fluctuations suddenly disappeared. And it explains something else, something we haven't wanted to acknowledge. It explains why human civilization appears so suddenly in the archaeological record. Not because we were just figuring out agriculture for the first time, but because we were recovering, rebuilding, relearning. Consider the domestication of plants and animals. The standard model suggests this happened gradually, as humans experimented with wild species over thousands of years, slowly selecting for desirable traits. Yet the archaeological evidence shows something different. Domestication appears relatively rapidly in multiple locations: the Fertile Crescent, East Asia, Mesoamerica, the Andean highlands. In each location, multiple species are domesticated in relatively short time frames. Wheat, barley, lentils, peas, all show signs of domestication by 10,000 years ago in the Near East. Rice in China by 9,000 years ago. Maize, beans, squash in Mesoamerica by 8,000 years ago. These are complex processes. Modern attempts to domesticate wild plants have shown how difficult it is, how many generations are required to produce significant changes. Unless you already know what you're doing. Unless you already know that certain wild grasses can be transformed into reliable grain crops. Unless you already understand selective breeding and the principles of agriculture. Then the process becomes much faster, not discovery, but rediscovery. Not innovation, but restoration. The same pattern appears with animal domestication. Dogs were domesticated much earlier, perhaps 30,000 years ago, but sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle all show evidence of domestication in a relatively narrow window after the Younger Dryas. Again, in multiple locations. Again, too quickly and too simultaneously to be entirely independent developments unless knowledge was somehow shared or remembered. Architecture tells a similar story. Göbekli Tepe isn't just anomalous in its age. It's anomalous in its sophistication. The builders understood quarrying, transport of multi-ton stones, carving, construction, geometry, and astronomy. These aren't skills developed overnight. They require knowledge accumulated over generations. Yet there's no evidence of a progression leading to Göbekli Tepe. It appears fully formed at the beginning of the post-Younger Dryas period. Later sites in the region are actually less sophisticated, as if the knowledge was degrading rather than accumulating. This is backwards from what we'd expect if civilization were developing for the first time. What we see instead resembles a pattern found throughout history. After major catastrophes, survivors attempt to rebuild using whatever knowledge they retained, but without the infrastructure, resources, and population to fully replicate what was lost, they create diminished versions. Later generations, further removed from the catastrophe, work with less knowledge and produce even more simplified structures. This is the pattern of decline and recovery, not the pattern of initial development. The question becomes, what was lost? If there was a pre-Younger Dryas civilization, what did it look like? How advanced was it? We should be careful not to project our own technological paradigm backward. The absence of evidence for metal tools or electronic devices doesn't mean the civilization was primitive. Technology takes many forms. A society sophisticated in architecture, agriculture, astronomy, and social organization is sophisticated indeed, even without electronics or steel. Stone construction, properly executed, lasts far longer than metal, which corrodes, or organic materials, which decay. The great megaliths of the ancient world, Göbekli Tepe, Stonehenge, the Egyptian pyramids, Baalbek, Sacsayhuaman, these endure. If a pre-Younger Dryas civilization worked primarily in stone and organic materials, the stone would be the only evidence remaining after 12,000 years, especially if most settlements were in coastal regions now submerged. And we are finding evidence underwater. As technology has improved, allowing for detailed mapping of the continental shelves, anomalies have begun appearing. Structures that look artificial, located at depths corresponding to sea levels from the late Pleistocene. Most are dismissed as natural formations, and many probably are. But some resist easy explanation. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument presents massive stone structures with right angles, flat surfaces, and what appear to be carved steps and terraces. Geologists argue over whether it's natural or artificial. The formations are unusual enough that even those arguing for natural formation admit they've been modified by humans. Others insist the entire complex is constructed. It sits 25 meters below current sea level, in waters that were last dry land around 10,000 years ago. In the Mediterranean, several submerged settlements have been found dating to periods when sea levels were lower. Some are acknowledged as human constructions, fishing villages from 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. Others are older, deeper, more controversial. Structures off the coast of Greece, off the coast of Cuba, off the coast of India, each claimed by some researchers to show signs of artificial construction, each dismissed by others as wishful thinking imposed on natural geology. The problem is methodological. Underwater archaeology is expensive and difficult. Detailed examination of these sites requires resources most researchers don't have. And there's a circular problem. Funding isn't allocated because the sites aren't proven to be artificial, but they can't be proven artificial without funding for proper investigation. So they remain in limbo, noted, documented, unexplained, neither confirmed nor rejected, just left in the category of interesting anomalies that don't fit neatly into established narratives. But the anomalies accumulate. Submerged structures, post-Younger Dryas sites that appear too sophisticated, genetic evidence of population bottlenecks, climate data showing catastrophic impacts, myths from around the world describing the same events, the platinum anomaly, the nanodiamonds, the magnetic spherules, the sudden appearance of agriculture and animal domestication, the rapid development of complex societies. Each piece of evidence examined alone can be explained away, but together, they form a picture that's difficult to ignore. Something happened. Something catastrophic. Something that reset human civilization and forced survivors to rebuild. The nature of the catastrophe is becoming clearer. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, once dismissed as fringe, has gained significant support as evidence accumulates. The physical signatures of cosmic impact are present in the right layers. The timing matches both the climate data and the archaeological transitions. The global distribution of impact markers suggests multiple fragments striking Earth, which is consistent with a disintegrating comet rather than a single asteroid. Comets are particularly dangerous because they're less predictable than asteroids and can fragment as they approach the Sun, creating swarms of debris that can bombard Earth over hours or days. A large comet fragmenting in the inner solar system, with Earth passing through the debris field, would produce exactly the kind of multiple impact scenario that the evidence suggests. The scale of such an event is difficult to comprehend. Each major fragment would have released energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons. The thermal radiation would have ignited fires across continents. The blast waves would have leveled anything standing. Impacts in ice sheets would have created instant floods of biblical proportions. Impacts in oceans would have generated tsunamis that would have crossed entire ocean basins before breaking against distant shores. For people living through it, the experience would have been apocalyptic in the truest sense, a revealing of the end of the world as they knew it. The sky would have lit up with fireballs. The ground would have shaken. Walls of water would have appeared on horizons. Fires would have consumed forests and settlements. Then darkness would have fallen, literal darkness as debris in the atmosphere blocked the sun, followed by the darkness of a civilization collapsing. The survivors would have been scattered, traumatized, facing a world transformed. Coastal settlements, likely the centers of any pre-impact civilization, would have been inundated or destroyed. Infrastructure would have been ruined. Food sources would have collapsed. The carefully accumulated knowledge of generations would have resided in the minds of a rapidly dying population. In such circumstances, survival becomes the only priority. Sophisticated arts and sciences become luxuries that can't be maintained when every day is a struggle to find food and shelter. Knowledge degrades. Skills are lost. Within a few generations, only fragments remain. Stories of a better time before the catastrophe, methods for essential tasks like farming and construction, ritualized practices whose original purposes are half forgotten. This is how civilizations fall, not usually through complete annihilation, but through disruption so severe that complexity cannot be maintained. The survivors carry on, but they carry on at a lower level of organization, preserving what they can but losing much more. And then, slowly, they begin to rebuild. As conditions stabilize, as populations recover, as resources become available again, the fragments of old knowledge are applied in new contexts. Agriculture returns. Settlements form. Social complexity reemerges. Construction begins again, not necessarily replicating what was lost, but building on whatever foundations and knowledge remained. This is what we see in the archaeological record after the Younger Dryas. Not the first flowering of human civilization, but its second. Not discovery, but rediscovery. Not the dawn, but the Renaissance. The evidence has been there all along, hidden in plain sight. We just weren't asking the right questions because we assumed we knew the answer. We assumed humans were simple hunter-gatherers until agriculture suddenly transformed everything. We assumed civilization was a one-time development, a steady accumulation of knowledge and complexity from zero to our current state. But what if that's not how it works? What if civilization is more fragile than we think? What if we've done this before, maybe more than once, building and losing and building again across vast spans of time? The genetic evidence supports this possibility in unexpected ways. Analysis of human populations worldwide shows something peculiar. A significant population bottleneck approximately 12,000 years ago. Genetic diversity drops sharply, then slowly recovers. This is the signature of a near-extinction event, something that reduced human populations dramatically before they began expanding again. The timing is precise, right at the Younger Dryas boundary, right when the impacts would have occurred. Other species show the same pattern. Many large mammals went extinct at the Younger Dryas boundary. Others survived, but with severe population reductions. The megafauna that had adapted to Ice Age conditions over millions of years suddenly disappeared. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and dozens of other species. Climate change alone struggles to explain these extinctions. These animals had survived previous climate fluctuations. The transition from glacial to interglacial conditions had happened before without causing such widespread extinctions. Something more was needed, something catastrophic and sudden. Human hunting has been proposed as the cause, the overkill hypothesis. But this requires believing that humans, with Stone Age weapons, managed to hunt dozens of species to extinction across multiple continents simultaneously, despite having coexisted with these animals for thousands of years without driving them extinct. It's possible, but it strains credibility. A cosmic impact event provides a more parsimonious explanation. The direct effects, thermal radiation, blast waves, fires, floods, would have killed massive numbers of animals outright. The secondary effects, climate disruption, habitat destruction, food chain collapse, would have pushed surviving populations beyond recovery thresholds. Human populations would have suffered the same fate, reduced to scattered survivors struggling in a transformed world. This raises an uncomfortable question. If humans nearly went extinct, if our population was reduced to some small fraction of what it had been, then how much knowledge would have survived? How much could have survived? Literacy is a recent invention in the conventional timeline, appearing only around 5,000 years ago. If the pre-Younger Dryas civilization was pre-literate, then all their knowledge would have been preserved orally, in the memories of living people. When those people died in the catastrophe or in the difficult years that followed, their knowledge died with them unless it was successfully transmitted to the next generation. Some knowledge would have been preserved, the essential skills for survival. How to make fire, how to fashion tools, how to hunt and gather, how to find water. These are the basics that cannot be lost or the species itself is lost. Other knowledge would have been partially preserved. The knowledge that enough people retained enough fragments of that it could be pieced back together eventually. Agriculture fits this category. If thousands of people knew how to cultivate crops, then even if most died, the survivors could reestablish agricultural practices, though perhaps without the full sophistication of what had been lost. But specialized knowledge, known to only small numbers of people, would have been at highest risk. Advanced construction techniques, astronomical observations, mathematical principles, navigation methods, metallurgy if it existed, any art or science that required years of training to master, these would have been most likely to be lost entirely or reduced to garbled fragments. What we'd see afterward would be a population trying to rebuild, possessing some practical knowledge but lacking much of the theoretical understanding that had originally produced that knowledge. They could still farm, but they might not understand the principles of selective breeding as clearly. They could still build, but they might not be able to reproduce the most sophisticated structures. They could still navigate, but they might have lost the detailed astronomical knowledge that once guided them. This matches what we observe. The post-Younger Dryas societies show practical competence combined with apparent gaps in knowledge. Göbekli Tepe is sophisticated in construction but appears to be built by people who aren't fully literate, who record information in stone carvings rather than writing. Early agriculture is effective but shows signs of relearning. Crop varieties aren't as optimized as they could be, suggesting the process is being redone rather than continuing from a well-established foundation. It's the pattern of recovery, of people working with inherited knowledge they don't fully understand, applying fragments of old wisdom in new contexts, succeeding in some areas and struggling in others. The myths preserve this memory, encoded in religious narratives. The fall from a golden age. The time when ancestors were greater than current generations. The knowledge that was lost and must be regained. The gods who once walked among humans and taught them arts and sciences. We've interpreted these as metaphors, as moral teachings about pride and humility. But what if they're also history? What if they preserve memory of a time when knowledge was more advanced, a time before the catastrophe, and the gods who taught humans were simply the ancestors who survived and tried to pass on what they remembered? This interpretation makes sense of otherwise puzzling elements in ancient myths. Why do so many cultures describe a time when the ancestors were more knowledgeable? Because they lived before the knowledge was lost. Why do myths often describe knowledge as being given by gods or culture heroes rather than developed gradually? Because from the perspective of people living in diminished circumstances, the greater knowledge of the ancestors would have seemed almost divine, and the transmission of that knowledge would have been a sacred act, a restoration of what the catastrophe had taken. Why do myths emphasize the importance of remembering and preserving stories? Because after a catastrophe that destroyed most written records, if they existed, and killed most of the people who held knowledge, remembering became literally a matter of survival, the survival not just of individuals but of civilization itself. The astronomical references in these myths take on new significance through this lens. Many ancient cultures placed enormous emphasis on observing the sky, tracking celestial movements, recording astronomical events with precision that seems unnecessary for agricultural societies. Why? Perhaps because the catastrophe came from the sky. Because the survivors watched comets fragment and fall, watched the sky turn dark, watched the familiar stars obscured for months or years. Because they understood, in a way we've forgotten, that the cosmos is not benign, that rocks fall from space, that humanity's existence is contingent on not being in the wrong place when the next impact occurs. Many ancient structures align with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, specific star risings, lunar cycles. We've interpreted this as religious significance, as fertility cults focused on seasons. But what if it's also astronomical observation, a systematic attempt to track the sky, to watch for threats, to ensure that if something comes again, there will be warning? Göbekli Tepe's Pillar 43, with its apparent depiction of the impact event, includes what may be astronomical markers, constellations positioned as they would have been at the time of the catastrophe. If this interpretation is correct, then the pillar serves as both memorial and warning. Says, this happened here when the sky looked like this. Remember, watch for it happening again. Other ancient sites show similar concerns. Stone circles that track celestial movements with precision. Temples aligned to specific stellar events. Myths about sky gods who must be appeased or disasters will follow. Creation stories that emphasize chaos coming from above, from the realm of the gods, requiring constant vigilance and ritual to prevent recurrence. We've assumed this is superstition, primitive attempts to control natural phenomena through magic. But sophisticated astronomical observation isn't superstition. It's science. The ancient astronomers who could predict eclipses, who tracked planetary motions, who understood precession of the equinoxes weren't practicing magic. They were practicing astronomy, even if they wrapped it in religious language. What they lacked wasn't intelligence or observational skill. It was institutional continuity. When your civilization has been destroyed and rebuilt, when knowledge has been partially lost and must be relearned, you preserve what you can in whatever form will survive. For pre-literate or early literate societies, that form is religious ritual, astronomical monuments, oral traditions, and sacred architecture, things that will outlast individual lives and transmit knowledge across generations even if people forget why the knowledge matters. This is why ancient astronomy is often mixed with astrology, why astronomical observations are embedded in religious practices, why calendars have ritual significance. It's not confusion between science and superstition. It's a method of knowledge preservation developed by people who understood that information must be protected against loss, and that giving it sacred significance is one way to ensure it gets transmitted. The sophistication of some ancient astronomical knowledge is otherwise hard to explain. The ancient astronomers of Babylon could predict eclipses. The builders of Stonehenge understood complex celestial cycles. The Mayans developed calendars of remarkable accuracy. The ancient Egyptians aligned the pyramids to celestial north with precision that modern surveyors struggle to match. These accomplishments required not just observation but understanding, mathematical models, geometric principles, accumulated data across many generations. They required institutions capable of preserving knowledge, training new generations of specialists, maintaining observational records over centuries. How does a newly agricultural society develop such sophisticated astronomy within a few thousand years? The conventional answer is that they were motivated by agricultural needs, tracking seasons, predicting floods, organizing planting cycles. But this seems insufficient. You don't need to predict eclipses or track precession to farm successfully. You don't need geometric perfection in monument construction to mark the equinoxes. Unless you're not developing astronomy from scratch. Unless you're recovering it, rebuilding it, working from fragments of older knowledge. Then the sophisticated elements that seem out of place, the excess precision, the advanced mathematical concepts, the complexity beyond practical necessity, make sense. They're remnants of the before, preserved and rebuilt imperfectly by the after. The mathematical systems of ancient cultures also show curious sophistication. The Sumerians used base 60 mathematics, a sexagesimal system that we still use for measuring time and angles. Why base 60? It's not intuitive like base 10, counting on fingers. It's not simple like base 2 or base 12. But it's mathematically elegant, easily divisible by many numbers, well-suited for astronomical calculations. Did the Sumerians develop this system from scratch? Or did they inherit it from somewhere else, from the before time, preserving it because it was part of the old knowledge that must not be lost? We can't answer these questions with certainty because the evidence is fragmentary, ambiguous, open to interpretation. But we can note the pattern. Ancient cultures showing mathematical and astronomical sophistication that seems advanced for their supposed level of social development, combined with gaps in other areas, as if knowledge was unevenly preserved. This is the pattern of recovery after catastrophic loss. Some knowledge is preserved because many people knew it or because it was essential for survival. Other knowledge is preserved because it was considered sacred and was guarded by specialists. Still other knowledge is lost entirely because too few people knew it and all of them died or failed to transmit it. What we see in the ancient world, then, isn't the first development of civilization but its reconstruction. Not the dawn of human achievement but its rebirth. And if that's true, then we need to fundamentally reconsider how we understand human history and human potential. The implications ripple outward in uncomfortable directions. If a catastrophic impact reset human civilization 12,000 years ago, then we need to ask, how many times has this happened? How many civilizations have risen and fallen across the vast spans of time, leaving behind traces so faint we can't recognize them as artificial? Anatomically, modern humans have existed for approximately 300,000 years. Behaviorally, modern humans, showing evidence of symbolic thinking, art, and complex tool use, emerged at least 70,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Yet we're supposed to believe that for 95% of that time, humans remained hunter-gatherers without developing permanent settlements or complex societies, and then suddenly, almost simultaneously across the globe, We figured it all out in the span of a few thousand years. This strains credibility. Human intelligence didn't suddenly increase 12,000 years ago. Our brains were the same size, our cognitive capacity the same, our ability to learn and innovate unchanged. Why would we spend 50,000 or 100,000 or 200,000 years wandering without building anything permanent, and then abruptly shift to creating complex civilizations? Unless we didn't. Unless we'd built before and lost it. Unless the pattern of rise and fall has repeated multiple times, and we're only now recognizing the most recent iteration because it's the closest to us in time and hasn't been completely erased by geological processes. The deep past is difficult to read. Erosion, sedimentation, plate tectonics, glaciation, all of these processes actively destroy evidence. Organic materials decay. Stone structures weather and collapse. Metal corrodes. Even concrete and steel, the materials of modern construction, would largely disappear within a few 100,000 years, leaving behind only faint chemical traces and perhaps some remnants of the most massive structures in geologically stable areas. If a civilization equivalent to Bronze Age societies had existed 50,000 years ago, what evidence would remain? Their cities, if built of wood and mud brick, would be gone. Their farms would be indistinguishable from natural landscapes. Their stone tools would look like the stone tools we already find and attribute to hunter-gatherers. Only if they built in stone on a massive scale, like the megalithic cultures, would there be clear evidence. And even that would be degraded, weathered, partially buried, easily mistaken for natural formations without detailed analysis. And if such a civilization had developed primarily in coastal regions that are now underwater, if sea level rise had drowned their settlements, then there would be almost nothing to find, just some anomalous underwater formations that most researchers dismiss as natural geology. We can't prove such civilizations existed, but we also can't prove they didn't. The absence of evidence in this case truly isn't evidence of absence. It's simply absence of evidence in conditions where evidence wouldn't be expected to survive. What we can say with increasing confidence is that something happened at the Younger Dryas boundary. The physical evidence is accumulating too consistently to dismiss. The climate shifted catastrophically. Impact markers appear in the geological record. Extinctions occurred. Human populations crashed. And immediately afterward, complex societies began emerging with sophisticated knowledge that shouldn't have existed if humans were truly starting from scratch. The survivors of the Younger Dryas impacts would have carried forward whatever knowledge they could preserve. Some of it would have been practical, how to make tools, how to farm, how to build shelters. Some of it might have been more abstract, astronomical knowledge, mathematical principles, construction techniques. But all of it would have been filtered through the trauma of the catastrophe, reinterpreted in light of the disaster, preserved in forms that could survive the collapse of whatever social structures had existed before. This is why myths from around the world share common themes. Not because they're archetypes emerging from the collective unconscious, not because they spread through diffusion, but because they preserve memory of the same event, the event that nearly ended human civilization and forced the survivors to start over. The flood myths remember the rising waters. The fire from the sky myths remember the impacts. The myths of a golden age remember the before time. The myths of gods teaching humans remember the transmission of knowledge from survivors who seemed godlike in their wisdom compared to the diminished state of post-catastrophe humanity. The myths about sacred knowledge that must be preserved remember the desperate attempt to maintain civilization's accumulated wisdom through a dark age. And the myths about the end of the world, about cycles of destruction and creation, about civilizations rising and falling, these might not be metaphysical speculation or moral teaching. They might be traumatic historical memory, preserved and ritualized into religious narratives that will be repeated generation after generation, ensuring that humanity never forgets. This has happened before, it could happen again, and we must watch the skies. The ancient obsession with astronomy takes on darker significance. They weren't just marking seasons or practicing astrology. They were watching, looking for the next threat, trying to understand the cosmos well enough to predict when danger might come again. Building monuments that would outlast civilizations to preserve the memory and warn future generations. We've lost that vigilance. We've forgotten why our ancestors watched the sky so carefully. We've dismissed their warnings as superstition. But they knew something we're only now relearning. Space is not empty, Earth is not safe, and cosmic impacts are not hypothetical ancient history. They're recurring threats that have shaped human history and will shape it again. The difference is that we now have the potential tools to do something about it. We can track near-Earth objects. We might, eventually, be able to deflect them. But first we have to remember that the threat is real, that our ancestors experienced it, that civilization is more fragile than we like to believe. The fragility of civilization is perhaps the most unsettling lesson from the Younger Dryas period. We imagine our modern world as permanent, our knowledge as secure, our technologies as irreversible advances that humanity will never lose. But the archaeological record tells a different story. It tells of knowledge lost, of skills forgotten, of sophisticated cultures collapsing, and their descendants unable to replicate their achievements. After the fall of Rome, European civilizations couldn't build aqueducts or roads of comparable quality for 1,000 years. The recipe for Roman concrete was lost and only rediscovered in modern times through chemical analysis. The sophisticated astronomical knowledge of the ancient Greeks was preserved only because Arab scholars maintained and transmitted it during Europe's Dark Ages. The mathematical advances of Mesopotamia were forgotten and had to be rediscovered. And these are losses from civilizations that had writing, that left extensive records, that existed in recent history with continuous cultural connections to our present. If civilizations with libraries and universities and institutional knowledge transmission could lose so much, what happens to civilizations without writing, during catastrophes that kill most of the population? The Younger Dryas impacts would have been far more destructive than the fall of Rome. The comparison isn't even close. We're talking about global catastrophe, not regional political collapse. We're talking about rapid climate change, mass extinctions, and continent-scale destruction. We're talking about human populations reduced to scattered survivors struggling to maintain even basic survival, let alone sophisticated knowledge systems. In such circumstances, much would necessarily be lost. The question isn't whether knowledge was lost. It certainly was. The question is how much was preserved, in what form, and how effectively it was transmitted to later generations. The evidence suggests that some knowledge did survive and was rebuilt. Agriculture reappears too quickly and in too many locations to be entirely independent discovery. Sophisticated construction techniques appear in the archaeological record without clear antecedents, as if the knowledge already existed but were missing evidence of its earlier development. Astronomical knowledge appears already well developed in early civilizations, without the expected lengthy period of gradual discovery. This pattern of knowledge appearing already formed rather than developing gradually is what we'd expect if it was being recovered rather than discovered for the first time. People who remember fragments of old knowledge, even if they don't fully understand it, can apply it more quickly than people starting from zero. They know what's possible even if they don't know exactly how it was done, and that knowledge of possibility is itself valuable. Göbekli Tepe remains the clearest example. It shouldn't exist according to our models. The conventional explanation is that we've underestimated what hunter-gatherer societies could achieve, that the desire to create religious sites motivated the development of construction techniques and social organization. But this explanation feels backwards. You don't develop complex construction techniques and social organization in order to build a temple. You build a temple after you've already developed those capabilities. Unless building the temple is itself an act of remembrance. Unless the survivors of the catastrophe, living in diminished circumstances, were trying to recreate something they'd seen before, something from the before time. They might not have fully understood what they were recreating or why the ancestors had built such structures. But they remembered that such places were important, that they had sacred significance, that building them was part of what it meant to be civilized rather than merely surviving. This would explain the strange quality of Göbekli Tepe, sophisticated in some ways, primitive in others. The builders could work stone with remarkable skill, suggesting expertise passed down from earlier times. But they didn't have writing, didn't build permanent dwellings on site, didn't show other signs of a fully developed civilization. They were people in transition, recovering from catastrophe, rebuilding culture from fragments. And then, mysteriously, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE. The builders didn't abandon it. They carefully filled in the excavations, burying the pillars under tons of rubble, preserving them for future discovery. Why? We don't know. The conventional theories involve changing religious beliefs or social organization. But another possibility exists. Perhaps they'd achieved what they set out to do. Perhaps they'd created the memorial they intended, preserved the knowledge in stone that needed to be preserved, and then buried it to protect it for a future that might need to rediscover it. If so, their plan worked. 11,000 years later, we've uncovered their message. We're reading the stones. We're beginning to understand what they were trying to tell us about the event that nearly ended their world. Other sites around the world might hold similar messages. The megalithic structures that dot coastlines and islands, were they simply monuments, or were they also markers? The massive stones at Baalbek in Lebanon, weighing up to 1,200 tons each, transported and placed with techniques we still can't fully explain. Were they just temple foundations, or were they demonstrations of knowledge preserved from an earlier age? The precision-cut stones of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, fitted together so tightly that a knife blade can't slip between them, were they merely impressive architecture, or were they proof that the builders' ancestors knew techniques that were being recovered and reapplied? We've approached these questions from the assumption that ancient peoples had only the technology we've directly found evidence for: stone and copper tools, rope and wooden levers, patience and muscle power. And certainly humans can achieve remarkable things with simple tools and sufficient time. But what if some ancient cultures had more than we've assumed? Not necessarily advanced metallurgy or electronics, but perhaps knowledge of techniques we've lost or never developed: acoustic levitation, chemical stone softening, methods for precise stone cutting that don't require modern diamond saws. This sounds like fringe speculation, and perhaps it is. But the stones exist. The constructions exist. They were built somehow, and the official explanations often feel unsatisfying, requiring us to believe that ancient peoples, using the most primitive tools imaginable, achieved precision and scale that modern engineers struggle to replicate. The alternative, that they possessed knowledge we lack, knowledge preserved from pre-catastrophe times or rediscovered through methods we haven't considered, deserves at least consideration. Not acceptance without evidence, but consideration. A willingness to examine the anomalies rather than explaining them away because they don't fit our models. The academic resistance to these ideas is understandable. Science progresses by building on established knowledge, not by constantly questioning foundations. Too much skepticism of mainstream theories leads to paralysis, an inability to build coherent models because everything is always in question. But too little skepticism leads to rigidity, an unwillingness to revise models when new evidence emerges. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis faced this resistance. Despite accumulating evidence, it was dismissed for decades because it challenged established models of gradual climate change and human development. Only persistent research by scientists willing to risk professional credibility eventually forced the mainstream to acknowledge the evidence. Now the hypothesis is gaining acceptance. The platinum anomaly is confirmed. The nanodiamonds are confirmed. The magnetic spherules are confirmed. The carbon-rich black mats are confirmed. The timing with climate change is confirmed. The correlation with extinctions is confirmed. The impact markers from multiple sites across multiple continents, all dating to the same narrow window, all confirmed. What remains controversial is the interpretation. Did these impacts trigger the Younger Dryas cooling? Did they cause the megafaunal extinctions? Most controversially, did they destroy a human civilization that was already more advanced than we've assumed? The first two questions are moving toward consensus acceptance. The evidence is strong enough that most scientists now acknowledge impacts occurred and likely had significant effects on climate and ecosystems. The third question remains contentious because it requires not just accepting the impacts but revising our entire understanding of human prehistory. That revision is threatening. Not because scientists are dogmatic, most are genuinely open to new evidence, but because accepting it means acknowledging that vast portions of human history might be unknowable. If sophisticated civilizations existed primarily in regions now underwater, if most evidence of their existence was destroyed by catastrophe and subsequent geological processes, then we're looking at a past that can never be fully reconstructed. This is uncomfortable. Science prefers questions that can be answered, problems that can be solved. A past that's partly unknowable, that must be inferred from fragments and anomalies rather than from direct evidence, feels too much like speculation. And the concern about encouraging unfounded speculation is valid. The ancient aliens crowd, the Atlantis enthusiasts, all those who see mysteries everywhere and accept no mainstream explanations, these groups do make it harder to have serious conversations about genuine anomalies. But the solution isn't to dismiss all anomalies as either natural formations or hoaxes. The solution is to investigate carefully, rigorously, without predetermined conclusions. To acknowledge when we don't know something rather than defaulting to whatever explanation fits existing models. To remain genuinely open to evidence even when it points in uncomfortable directions. The Younger Dryas impacts happened. That's no longer seriously in question. They had effects on climate, ecosystems, and human populations. That's increasingly accepted. Whether they destroyed a civilization remains debated, but the evidence is sufficient that the question deserves serious investigation rather than dismissal. What would such investigation look like? Systematic underwater archaeology of the continental shelves, particularly in regions that would have been prime habitation zones during the late Pleistocene, river valleys, coastal plains, areas with moderate climate. Advanced imaging techniques to identify potential structures beneath sediment. Genetic analysis of human populations to better understand the bottleneck and recovery. Continued examination of megaliths and ancient structures using modern technology to determine if they contain evidence of more sophisticated construction techniques than conventionally assumed. Interdisciplinary cooperation between archaeologists, geologists, climatologists, and other specialists to develop comprehensive models of what the pre-Younger Dryas world might have looked like. Some of this is beginning. Underwater archaeology has expanded. Genetic studies continue to reveal new details about human population history. Advanced imaging is being applied to ancient sites. The questions are starting to be asked. But progress is slow. Underwater archaeology is expensive. Academic careers are built on mainstream research, not controversial investigations. Funding bodies are conservative, preferring to support conventional projects over speculative ones. And there's always the risk of finding nothing, of investing resources in investigating hypothetical pre-Younger Dryas civilizations and concluding that they simply didn't exist. Yet even negative results would be valuable. If thorough investigation found no evidence of sophisticated pre-impact civilizations, that would help constrain our models, help us better understand what humans were actually doing during the late Pleistocene. We'd know rather than assume. More likely, investigation would find something intermediate. Evidence of human occupation and activity during the pre-Younger Dryas period that's more sophisticated than currently assumed but less advanced than modern. Civilizations. Settled communities. Complex structures. Evidence of social organization. But not the full array of characteristics we associate with historical civilizations. Cities, writing, elaborate art, extensive trade networks. This would make sense. Civilization exists on a continuum. There's no clear line between primitive and advanced, only gradual accumulation of complexity, knowledge, and social organization. A late Pleistocene civilization might have been at an intermediate stage, beyond simple hunter-gatherer bands, but not yet at the level of Bronze Age empires. Still, such a civilization, if destroyed by catastrophe, would have left survivors carrying knowledge that would speed the recovery and reemergence of complex societies after conditions stabilized. This intermediate scenario fits the evidence best. It explains the anomalies, the sophisticated knowledge appearing too quickly after the Younger Dryas, the construction techniques that seem advanced for their time, the astronomical knowledge already present in early civilizations. But it doesn't require believing in Atlantis-level civilizations with technologies matching or exceeding our own. It simply requires accepting that humans were more capable earlier than we've assumed. And why wouldn't they be? Humans 15,000 years ago had the same cognitive capacity as humans today. They were just as intelligent, just as capable of learning and innovation. They had tens of thousands of years of accumulated experience. Why assume they remained in a static state of simple hunting and gathering until some magical threshold was crossed 12,000 years ago? The conventional answer has always been that the Ice Age climate prevented more complex social organization, that only after the climate warmed could agriculture develop, which then enabled everything else. But this is increasingly questionable. Evidence suggests late Pleistocene climates were variable, with some regions experiencing quite moderate conditions even during glacial periods. Human populations inhabited diverse environments across multiple continents. The idea that all humans everywhere remained at the same level of social simplicity until the Ice Age ended seems implausible. More likely, different populations developed different levels of complexity depending on local conditions and resources. Some remained nomadic hunter-gatherers because that lifestyle worked well for their environment. Others, particularly in favorable regions, developed more settled lifestyles, more complex social structures, the beginnings of what we'd recognize as civilization. And then the impacts came. The populations living in the most favorable regions, likely coastal areas, river valleys, regions that are now underwater or buried under sediment, would have been most vulnerable. These would have been the areas hit hardest by floods from rapidly melting ice sheets and ocean impact tsunamis. These would have been where the most people lived and where, therefore, the most knowledge would have been lost when the populations were destroyed or scattered. The survivors would have been those living in more marginal areas, away from coasts at higher elevations, in regions that escaped the worst of the catastrophe. These populations would have been less affected but also potentially less advanced to begin with, having developed in less favorable environments. They'd have preserved some knowledge from contact with more advanced coastal populations, but they wouldn't have been the knowledge centers themselves. This creates an interesting dynamic for the recovery period. The knowledge that survived would have been fragmentary, pieces of more sophisticated understanding mixed with the practical skills of people who'd been living simpler lifestyles. As populations recovered and began rebuilding, they'd have been working with this mixed heritage. Memories and fragments from more advanced pre-impact cultures combined with the practical experience of survival in harsh post-impact conditions. This might explain some of the apparent contradictions we see in early post-Younger Dryas cultures. Sophisticated knowledge in some areas, astronomy, construction, mathematics, combined with seemingly primitive conditions in others, no writing, simple tools, limited trade. It's not that they were primitive people who somehow developed sophisticated knowledge in isolated domains. It's that they were people in recovery, rebuilding from fragments, preserving some knowledge successfully while other knowledge was lost or only partially retained. Göbekli Tepe, from this perspective, becomes less mysterious. It's not impossible architecture built by people who couldn't have known how. It's challenging architecture built by people who remembered that their ancestors had built in stone, who retained some construction knowledge even if the full sophisticated understanding was lost, who were motivated by memories of sacred places from before the catastrophe and wanted to recreate them in the new world. The same interpretive framework applies to other anomalous sites. Not evidence of impossible advancement, but evidence of recovered knowledge, of people building on foundations laid before the catastrophe even though the full complexity of those foundations was no longer accessible. This is a more nuanced picture than either extreme. It rejects the conventional view that humans were uniformly primitive until agriculture suddenly changed everything. But it also rejects the more exotic claims of lost supercivilizations with technologies matching or exceeding our own. Instead, it suggests a middle path. Late Pleistocene humans had developed more complex societies than conventionally acknowledged. These societies were disrupted by catastrophe, and the recovery involved rebuilding from fragments. The evidence increasingly supports this middle path. Not conclusively, the evidence is still fragmentary, the gaps in our knowledge still substantial. But the pattern is there. Anomalies suggesting more sophistication than expected, timings that align with catastrophic impact events, myths preserving memories of disasters and golden ages, genetic evidence of population crashes, rapid reemergence of complex societies after the Younger Dryas with knowledge that seems too advanced for their supposed level of development. None of this proves the case definitively, but it makes it plausible, worthy of serious investigation, deserving of more than dismissive skepticism. What would it mean if this revisionist view is correct? What are the implications beyond just rewriting some dates in textbooks? First, it would mean acknowledging that civilization is more fragile than we like to believe. Modern societies feel permanent, but the archaeological record would remind us that nothing is permanent, that even sophisticated cultures can be destroyed by natural catastrophes, that knowledge can be lost when the people who hold it die. This isn't comfortable. We prefer to believe in progress, in steady advancement, in the security of our accumulated knowledge. But the past suggests otherwise. It suggests cycles of building and destruction, of advancement and regression, of knowledge gained and lost. Second, it would mean recognizing that cosmic impacts are real threats, not just theoretical possibilities. They've happened before. They've had devastating effects. They'll happen again. The question isn't whether but when. Currently, we're doing minimal work to track near-Earth objects and develop deflection capabilities. This is partly because the threat feels abstract, distant, unlikely to occur in any given lifetime. But if we understood that impacts have destroyed civilizations before, that human populations have been reduced to survival mode by events from space, perhaps we take the threat more seriously. Third, it would change how we think about ancient cultures. Instead of seeing them as primitive peoples slowly groping toward knowledge, we'd see them as survivors and rebuilders, people who retained fragments of older knowledge and worked to restore what had been lost. Their achievements would be even more impressive. Not the first development of civilization, but its restoration under difficult conditions, preserving what could be preserved, relearning what had been forgotten, building anew on ancient foundations. This perspective creates more respect for ancient peoples, not less. It acknowledges their intelligence and capability. It recognizes that they face challenges we can barely imagine. Rebuilding civilization after its near destruction, preserving knowledge through oral tradition for generations before writing was redeveloped, creating sophisticated monuments and knowledge systems despite limited resources and population. They weren't primitives stumbling toward enlightenment. They were survivors determined to ensure that what had been lost wouldn't be lost forever. The myths take on deeper meaning through this lens. The stories of golden ages aren't just nostalgic fantasy. They're memories of the before time, when things were different, perhaps better in some ways. The stories of falls from grace aren't just moral teachings. They're traumatic memories of catastrophe, preserved because forgetting would be even more dangerous than remembering. The stories of gods teaching humans, they're memories of knowledge transmission from the few who survived with understanding to the many who needed to learn quickly to survive. And the emphasis on remembering, on preserving stories, on passing down traditions, this becomes not just cultural practice but survival strategy. After catastrophe, when most people are dead and most knowledge is lost, memory becomes precious. The stories must be preserved because they contain wisdom necessary for survival and recovery. Forgetting becomes dangerous because it means losing what the ancestors knew, leaving descendants to rediscover everything from scratch. This is why so many ancient cultures emphasized oral tradition, ritual repetition, memorization. It wasn't just superstition or primitive inability to develop writing. It was a systematic method of knowledge preservation developed by peoples who understood that knowledge was fragile, that it could be lost, that maintaining it required constant effort and repetition. Eventually, writing was developed or redeveloped, providing more reliable knowledge storage. But even then, the old methods persisted. Sacred texts were memorized, not just written. Rituals continued. Oral traditions remained important alongside written records. Because cultures that had experienced catastrophic loss understood that redundancy matters, that knowledge should be preserved in multiple formats, that you can't rely on any single method of transmission. We've lost this understanding. We assume our knowledge is secure, stored in libraries and databases, accessible whenever we need it. But how secure is it really? How much of our accumulated knowledge would survive if electrical grids failed? If the internet collapsed? If universities closed? If the people who understand complex systems died suddenly? More than would have survived the Younger Dryas impacts, certainly. We have better storage methods, more redundancy, larger populations. But we might be surprised by how much would be lost. Modern technology is complex and interdependent. Much of our knowledge is specialized. Individuals know small pieces of larger systems, but few understand the whole. If the systems failed and the specialists died, recovering the knowledge might be harder than we'd like to believe. This isn't paranoid doomerism. It's realistic assessment. Civilizations are complex systems, and complex systems are fragile. They can fail. When they fail, recovery depends on what knowledge survives and who survives to apply it. The ancients understood this because they'd lived it. They'd survived civilizational collapse. They'd experienced the loss of knowledge. They'd had to rebuild. and they created systems, myths, rituals, monuments, traditions designed to ensure that if it happened again, as much knowledge as possible would survive. We should learn from them. Not by adopting their specific methods, we have better options now, but by adopting their mindset. Recognize that civilization is fragile. Acknowledge that knowledge can be lost. Create redundancies. Preserve information in multiple formats. Ensure that critical knowledge is distributed widely rather than held by small groups of specialists. And watch the skies, because the threat that nearly ended their world is still out there, and it could return at any time. The Younger Dryas impacts weren't unique events. Cosmic collisions have happened throughout Earth's history and will happen again. Asteroids and comets continue to cross Earth's orbit. Most are small, causing limited damage when they strike. But larger ones exist, and eventually one will be on a collision course with Earth. We're better positioned than any previous human civilization to deal with this threat. We can track objects in space. We can calculate trajectories decades in advance. We're developing technologies that might allow us to deflect incoming objects, preventing impacts rather than merely surviving them. But these capabilities are recent and still limited. We don't track all near-Earth objects. We couldn't deflect the largest ones. If a comet fragment like those that struck during the Younger Dryas appeared tomorrow on collision course with Earth, we'd have warning but might not be able to prevent the impact. This is sobering. We like to think we've transcended the vulnerabilities of ancient peoples, that our technology has made us secure. But we're still subject to the same cosmic threats they faced. We're still vulnerable to catastrophes that could disrupt or destroy our civilization. The difference is awareness. We understand the threat in ways they couldn't. We know what comets and asteroids are, how they move, what happens when they strike. We have the beginning of capabilities to do something about it. Whether we develop those capabilities fully depends on whether we take the threat seriously. And whether we take it seriously might depend on whether we recognize that it's not hypothetical, that it's happened before, that human civilizations have been destroyed by impacts, and that we're not immune simply because we have computers and satellites. The Younger Dryas impacts serve as a historical lesson, if we're willing to learn it. They demonstrate that catastrophes can happen suddenly, on timescales too fast for adaptation. They show that even if some humans survive, much of what civilization has built can be lost. They illustrate how fragile our existence is on a planet that orbits through a solar system filled with debris left over from its formation. But they also demonstrate human resilience. Despite the catastrophe, despite the losses, despite the climate chaos and the die-off, humans survived. Not just survived, rebuilt. Within a few thousand years of the impacts, complex societies were emerging again. Within 10,000 years, civilizations had developed that would eventually create writing, metallurgy, and all the other achievements we associate with human advancement. This is remarkable. A species reduced to scattered populations, living in degraded environments, struggling with disrupted ecosystems, nonetheless recovered and rebuilt. The knowledge wasn't entirely lost. The capability remained. And when conditions stabilized, humanity resumed its trajectory toward complexity and achievement. This resilience is encouraging. It suggests that even major catastrophes, while devastating, aren't necessarily civilization-ending in the absolute sense. As long as some humans survive with some knowledge, recovery is possible. It might take generations or millennia, but it's possible. This doesn't mean catastrophes are acceptable or that we shouldn't work to prevent them. Obviously, avoiding an impact is far better than surviving one and rebuilding afterward. The suffering involved in civilizational collapse is immense. The knowledge and art and culture that's lost is irreplaceable. Prevention is vastly preferable to recovery. But if prevention fails, if despite our best efforts an impact occurs, the historical lesson is that recovery is possible. Humans are resilient. Knowledge can be preserved. Civilization can be rebuilt. The species will continue. This might be part of why the Younger Dryas survivors placed such emphasis on memory and preservation. They understood that catastrophe might strike again. They wanted to ensure that, if it did, the next generation of survivors would have whatever knowledge they could pass forward. They created monuments, Göbekli Tepe and others, not just as temples or tombs but as messages to the future, as repositories of knowledge in stone that would outlast any written records or oral traditions. We should do the same. Not necessarily by building megalithic monuments, we have better methods now, but by ensuring that critical knowledge is preserved in formats that could survive catastrophe. By distributing that knowledge widely rather than concentrating it in vulnerable locations. By teaching resilience and practical skills alongside specialized expertise. By remembering that civilization is an achievement that must be maintained, not a permanent state that maintains itself. The myths of ancient cultures often emphasize this. They tell of knowledge that must be preserved, of teachings that must be passed down, of warnings that must be heeded. They speak of cyclical time, of ages of destruction and renewal, of the importance of remembering history to avoid repeating it. We've tended to interpret these as metaphorical or spiritual teachings, but perhaps they're also practical advice from peoples who'd experienced civilizational collapse and wanted to ensure their descendants understood the lessons. Remember the past because it will repeat. Preserve knowledge because it can be lost. Prepare for catastrophe because it will come again. Build to last because impermanence is the rule, not the exception. These aren't comfortable messages. We prefer to believe in progress, in security, in permanence. But the archaeological record suggests otherwise. It suggests that civilizations rise and fall, that knowledge is gained and lost, that nothing is permanent except the cycle itself. This doesn't mean hopelessness or despair. It means realism. It means recognizing that maintaining civilization requires constant effort, that knowledge must be actively preserved, that we can't take our current state for granted. And it means preparing, not with paranoid survivalism, but with practical resilience. Ensuring that critical knowledge exists in multiple formats. Teaching practical skills that would be valuable in various scenarios. Creating social structures that are robust rather than fragile. Developing technologies that enhance resilience rather than creating new vulnerabilities. Most importantly, it means watching the skies, continuing to track near-Earth objects, improving our detection capabilities, developing deflection technologies, creating international cooperation so that if a threat is detected, humanity can respond collectively rather than each nation acting independently. We're better positioned than any previous civilization to meet this challenge. The Younger Dryas survivors didn't know what had hit them or whether it might strike again. They couldn't predict or prevent future impacts. All they could do was preserve what knowledge they could and hope their descendants would survive if it happened again. We can do better. We can know what's coming. We can track the threats. We can develop ways to prevent impacts rather than just surviving them. But only if we take the threat seriously, and only if we recognize that it's not hypothetical. The Younger Dryas impacts are the proof that it's not hypothetical. They happened. They devastated human populations. They reset civilization, and they could happen again. The question is whether we'll learn from history or repeat it. Whether we'll take action while we have time or wait until it's too late. Whether we'll be the civilization that survived through preparedness or the one that fell through complacency. The myths warn us. The monuments remind us. The geological record preserves the evidence. The message is clear. Remember what happened. Understand the threat. Prepare for the future. Will we listen? Will we act? Or will we, like so many civilizations before us, assume that catastrophe is something that happens to other people in other times, never to us, never now? The answer isn't written yet. We're living through the moment when the decision is being made. Our actions now will determine whether future archaeologists look back on our civilization as one that heeded the warnings and prepared accordingly, or as one that ignored the lessons of history and suffered the consequences. The Younger Dryas survivors left us messages in stone, preserved at Göbekli Tepe and other sites. They told us what happened to them. They warned us that it could happen again. They demonstrated through their achievement in rebuilding that human resilience is real, but also that the cost of catastrophe is immense. We should honor their effort by learning the lesson they tried so hard to preserve. Not by living in fear, but by living with awareness. Not by abandoning progress, but by pursuing resilient progress. Not by rejecting civilization, but by building civilization that acknowledges its fragility and works to reduce its vulnerabilities. This is the deeper meaning of the Younger Dryas period. Not just a scientific curiosity about ancient climate change. Not just an archaeological puzzle about the origins of civilization, but a lesson about human vulnerability and human resilience, about the threats we face and the capabilities we possess, about memory and forgetting, about what can be lost and what can be preserved. The conventional narrative tells us that civilization began around 12,000 years ago, when humans suddenly developed agriculture and started building permanent settlements. It's a simple story, easy to teach, easy to remember, but it's incomplete. The revised narrative suggests something different. That civilization is older than we've acknowledged, that it was disrupted by catastrophe, that what we see in the archaeological record is not the first development of complexity but its recovery. This narrative is more complicated, less tidy, harder to reduce to simple timelines and charts. But it better fits the evidence. And it better prepares us for the future. If we understand that civilization can be disrupted, that knowledge can be lost, that catastrophes can strike suddenly and devastatingly, then we'll be more motivated to create resilience, to preserve knowledge, to prepare for scenarios we hope won't occur but might. The Younger Dryas impacts weren't the first catastrophes humans experienced, and they won't be the last. But they're the most recent for which we have detailed evidence, and they occurred at a pivotal moment in human history, the transition between hunter-gatherer lifestyles and agricultural civilizations. They therefore offer unique insight into what can be lost and how recovery occurs. The survivors of those impacts faced a world transformed. The comfortable climate of the preceding millennia had been replaced by renewed glacial conditions. Familiar coastlines were drowned. Inland areas were disrupted by floods and fires. Many of the plants and animals they'd relied upon were gone. The social networks and knowledge systems they'd developed were shattered. Yet they persisted. They adapted. They preserved what knowledge they could. They passed it to their children and grandchildren. They created new social structures appropriate to their changed circumstances. And when the climate finally stabilized, they began building again, not from zero, but from the foundation of whatever knowledge had survived. This is the human story, not one of steady progress from ignorance to enlightenment, but one of persistence through adversity, of loss and recovery, of knowledge gained and lost and regained. It's a more complex story than the simple narratives we prefer, but it's also more accurate, more honest about the challenges humans have faced and the resilience we've demonstrated. It's also more relevant to our current situation. We face challenges now: climate change, resource depletion, technological risks, ecological degradation, that could disrupt our civilization. Not necessarily to the degree that the Younger Dryas impacts disrupted ancient civilizations, but significantly nonetheless. How we respond will determine whether future generations look back on us as wise ancestors who prepared and adapted, or as a cautionary tale of a civilization that ignored warning signs until it was too late. The Younger Dryas survivors couldn't prevent the catastrophe that struck them. We might be able to prevent or mitigate some of the challenges we face. We have capabilities they lacked. But we also face complexities they didn't have to deal with: larger populations, more interdependent systems, technologies that are powerful but also potentially dangerous. Whether our greater capabilities outweigh our greater complexities remains to be seen. But we can learn from their example. We can work to preserve knowledge, create resilience, prepare for scenarios we hope won't occur. We can build with an awareness of impermanence, creating systems that can adapt and survive rather than collapsing when conditions change. And we can remember that catastrophes have happened before. Remember that civilizations have fallen. Remember that knowledge can be lost. Remember that nothing is guaranteed. But also remember that humans are resilient, that we've survived catastrophes before, that knowledge can be preserved and transmitted, that civilization can be rebuilt. The Younger Dryas impacts nearly ended human civilization, but they didn't. We survived. We recovered. We rebuilt. And we're here, 12,000 years later, advanced enough to understand what happened to our ancestors and capable enough to perhaps prevent it from happening again. That's a remarkable achievement. It's worth honoring the survivors who made it possible by learning their lesson and applying it to our own time. The evidence continues to accumulate. More sites are being discovered that don't fit conventional timelines. More geological data confirms the impact signatures. More genetic analysis reveals the population bottleneck and recovery. More detailed climate models show the catastrophic disruption and subsequent stabilization. The picture becomes clearer. Something happened. Something devastating. Something that reset human civilization and forced a recovery that took thousands of years to fully accomplish. This isn't fringe speculation anymore. It's increasingly mainstream recognition that the Younger Dryas period was marked by catastrophic events with profound effects on human populations. The debates now are about details, exactly how many impacts, precisely where they struck, the full extent of their effects, not about whether something significant occurred. This shift in scientific consensus has happened gradually, as evidence accumulated and researchers were forced to acknowledge that the conventional explanations were insufficient. It's how science is supposed to work. New evidence leads to revised models, even when those revisions are uncomfortable. But the shift isn't complete. Many textbooks still teach the old timeline without mentioning the impacts. Many popularizations still present the simple narrative of agriculture leading to civilization without acknowledging the possibility of pre-Younger Dryas complexity. Many researchers remain skeptical of the more radical implications, accepting that impacts occurred but resisting the idea that they disrupted existing civilizations. This partial acceptance is understandable but ultimately unsatisfying. Either the impacts were devastating enough to reset civilization, or they weren't. If they were, then our models need substantial revision. If they weren't, then the evidence needs different interpretation. The evidence suggests they were devastating. The climate effects lasted over 1,000 years. The extinctions were extensive. The genetic bottleneck was severe. The archaeological changes were dramatic. All of this points to catastrophic disruption, not minor inconvenience. And the rapid emergence of sophisticated societies after the Younger Dryas ended makes more sense as recovery than as first development. People rebuilding from fragments of remembered knowledge would produce exactly the pattern we see. Sophisticated in some areas, basic in others, appearing suddenly without clear antecedents, showing knowledge that seems too advanced for the supposed level of social development. This is the pattern of recovery, and recognizing it as such changes how we understand human history. But beyond the academic question of when civilization began, there's a more profound question. What does it mean that we've forgotten? What does it say about us as a species that we've lost memory of our own catastrophe, that we've forgotten the lesson our ancestors tried so hard to preserve? Part of it is simply time. 12,000 years is a vast span. Oral traditions can preserve stories for centuries or even millennia, but eventually details fade, contexts are lost, historical accounts become mythology. Without writing to fix knowledge in permanent form, memory degrades across generations. But we've had writing for 5,000 years now. We've had the ability to preserve knowledge permanently, to ensure that critical lessons aren't lost. Yet we've still forgotten. We've treated ancient myths as primitive superstition rather than historical memory. We've dismissed warnings about cosmic catastrophes as fantasy. We've assumed that because we haven't experienced such events in recorded history, they must not be real threats. This is a failure of imagination and humility. We've assumed that our experience represents the full range of possibility, that what hasn't happened in the last few thousand years can't happen. We've forgotten that recorded history is a tiny slice of human existence, that our ancestors experienced events we can barely imagine, that the universe contains threats we've been lucky enough not to encounter yet. The Younger Dryas impacts remind us of our ignorance. They demonstrate that catastrophes can happen, that civilizations can fall, that humanity's existence is more contingent than we like to believe. They invite humility, acknowledgement that we don't know everything, that the past contains lessons we've forgotten, that our ancestors might have understood some things better than we do. This doesn't mean romanticizing the past or assuming ancient peoples had mystical knowledge we lack. It means recognizing that they had experiences we haven't shared, that they survived catastrophes we've only read about, that they developed strategies for preserving knowledge and maintaining resilience that we might benefit from understanding. It means listening to what they tried to tell us, even when it's encoded in myths we've dismissed as imagination. It means examining the monuments they built not just as archaeological curiosities but as potential messages. It means taking seriously the possibility that they knew something we've forgotten. The pillar at Göbekli Tepe with its apparent impact imagery, is it a historical record? A warning? Both? We can't be certain. But we can recognize that the builders put enormous effort into creating and preserving this site. They had reasons. Those reasons might have included recording and warning about catastrophic events. If so, they succeeded in preserving the message. We found it. We're starting to understand it. The question is whether we'll act on it. Because the threat they warned about hasn't gone away. Comets and asteroids still cross Earth's orbit. Impacts still occur, though most are small. But larger ones remain possible, and eventually one will be on collision course with Earth. When that happens, not if, but when, what will determine our fate is whether we're prepared. Whether we've developed detection and deflection capabilities. Whether we've built resilient systems that can survive disruption. Whether we've preserved knowledge in ways that could survive catastrophe. Whether we've learned the lesson that the Younger Dryas survivors tried to teach us. So far, our track record is mixed. We've made progress on detection, we now track many near-Earth objects and are discovering more. We've begun developing deflection concepts, though none are yet fully operational. We've preserved knowledge better than any previous civilization, though our systems might be more fragile than we realize. We could do better. We could treat cosmic impact as the serious threat it is, rather than as a remote possibility. We could invest more in detection and deflection. We could create better knowledge preservation systems. We could build more resilience into our critical infrastructure. Whether we will depends on whether we learn from history, whether we recognize that the Younger Dryas impacts are a warning, not just an interesting bit of ancient climate science. Whether we understand that catastrophes can happen to us, not just to ancient peoples in distant times. The evidence is there. The lesson is clear. Whether we learn it is up to us. And the stakes are high, not just for individuals or communities, but for civilization itself. The Younger Dryas impacts nearly ended human civilization. If similar impacts occurred now, the effects could be even worse. Our population is far larger, our systems more complex and interdependent, our knowledge more specialized. More people would survive in absolute numbers, but the percentage might be lower. And recovery might be harder, not easier, because we've lost many of the practical skills that enabled previous generations to survive without modern technology. This isn't meant to inspire despair. It's meant to inspire action. Recognition that we're vulnerable should motivate us to reduce vulnerabilities. Understanding that catastrophes can happen should drive us to prepare for them. Knowing that knowledge can be lost should encourage us to preserve it better. We have advantages the Younger Dryas survivors lacked. We understand what impacts are and how they work. We can see them coming. We might be able to prevent them. But these advantages only matter if we use them. The survivors 12,000 years ago couldn't prevent the catastrophe. They could only endure it and rebuild afterward. They did so successfully, we're here as proof. But the cost was enormous. Most people died. Most knowledge was lost. Recovery took millennia. We can do better. We can prepare. We can prevent or at least mitigate. But only if we take the threat seriously. Only if we learn from history rather than dismissing it as irrelevant to our modern world. The Younger Dryas period stands as a testament to both human vulnerability and human resilience. We were vulnerable, nearly destroyed by events beyond our control. But we were also resilient, we survived, we rebuilt, we recovered. Both lessons matter. Understanding vulnerability keeps us humble and cautious. Understanding resilience gives us confidence to face challenges rather than being paralyzed by fear. Together, they provide a balanced perspective. We're not invulnerable, but we're also not helpless. We can be affected by catastrophes, but we can also prepare for them and recover from them. This balance is important. Too much focus on vulnerability leads to despair or paralysis. Too much focus on resilience leads to complacency. We need both, recognition that threats are real combined with confidence that we can address them. The Younger Dryas survivors achieved this balance. They didn't forget what had happened. They preserved the memory. encoded it in their most sacred sites and stories. But they also didn't let fear paralyze them. They rebuilt. They created new civilizations. They moved forward while remembering the past. This is the model we should follow. Remember the threats. Understand the vulnerabilities. But also act. Build. Prepare. Create resilience. Move forward with awareness rather than ignorance, with preparation rather than complacency. The monuments the survivors built, Göbekli Tepe and others, serve multiple purposes. They're memorials to what was lost. They're warnings about what happened. They're demonstrations that knowledge survived and civilization could be rebuilt. They're messages to future generations, to us, saying, remember this, learn from this, prepare for this. We're receiving that message now, 12,000 years later. We're decoding the symbolism, understanding the astronomical references, recognizing the impact imagery. We're beginning to comprehend what they went through and what they wanted us to know. The question is whether we'll honor their effort by applying the lesson, whether we'll prepare for the threats they warned us about, whether we'll build with awareness of fragility, whether we'll preserve knowledge understanding that it can be lost. This is what they would want, not for us to live in fear, but to live with awareness, not to abandon progress, but to pursue sustainable, resilient progress, not to forget their catastrophe, but to learn from it. Their message is urgent, not because an impact is imminent, we have no evidence of that, but because preparation takes time. Developing detection and deflection capabilities takes decades. Building resilient systems takes years. Changing how we approach knowledge preservation and social organization takes generations. If we wait until a threat is detected, it will be too late. The time to prepare is now, while we have the luxury of time, while we're not facing immediate crisis. This is what the Younger Dryas survivors understood. They prepared their descendants. They created systems to preserve knowledge. They built monuments that would outlast any individual lifetime or even any individual civilization. They thought in terms of deep time, of lessons that needed to be transmitted across thousands of years. We should think similarly. We should prepare not just for our lifetimes but for our descendants' lifetimes. We should create systems that can survive disruption. We should preserve knowledge in formats that will outlast current technologies. We should build with awareness that impermanence is the rule and permanence the rare exception. This is long-term thinking. It's out of fashion in our immediate gratification culture. We're more concerned with quarterly profits than century-scale planning. We're more interested in next year's election than next generation's survival. But long-term thinking is what's needed. The threats we face, cosmic impacts, climate change, technological risks, operate on timescales longer than electoral cycles or corporate planning horizons. Addressing them requires thinking and planning across generations. The Younger Dryas survivors did this. Despite living in difficult circumstances, despite having limited resources, despite facing immediate survival challenges, they still thought about the long term. They created monuments meant to last thousands of years. They developed knowledge preservation systems meant to survive their own deaths. They planned for futures they wouldn't live to see. We have more resources than they did. We have better technologies. We have greater knowledge. We have no excuse for not matching their long-term vision. Yet often we fail to do so. We focus on the immediate, the practical, the profitable. We neglect long-term challenges because they don't seem urgent. We assume future generations will handle future problems, just as we've handled problems inherited from past generations. But some problems can't be deferred. Some preparations must be made in advance. Some knowledge must be preserved before it's lost. Waiting until crisis strikes to begin preparing guarantees that preparation will be inadequate. The Younger Dryas' impacts demonstrate this. The survivors couldn't prevent the catastrophe. It struck too suddenly, too devastatingly. All they could do was cope with the aftermath and try to rebuild. They succeeded, but at enormous cost. We might be able to prevent the next catastrophe, or at least mitigate it. But only if we prepare in advance. Only if we develop capabilities before we need them. Only if we act while we still have time. This is the practical lesson of the Younger Dryas period. Not just a historical curiosity, but a warning with contemporary relevance. The threat that struck them still exists, could strike us. Whether we survive and how quickly we recover depends on choices we make now. This should inform our priorities. Space monitoring and planetary defense should receive adequate funding. Knowledge preservation systems should be robustly designed with multiple redundancies. Resilient infrastructure should be valued over efficient but fragile systems. Long-term planning should be integrated into governance and decision-making at all levels. These aren't the priorities we currently have. We're not seriously preparing for cosmic impacts. Our knowledge preservation systems are vulnerable to infrastructure failure. We optimize for efficiency over resilience. We plan for years or decades, not centuries or millennia. This needs to change. And it can change. We have the resources and capabilities. What's lacking is will and awareness. The will comes from understanding the stakes. The awareness comes from studying history and recognizing that threats are real. Both can be cultivated. The Younger Dryas period provides the historical lesson that can cultivate both. This is why this history matters. Not just as academic knowledge, but as practical wisdom. The survivors tried to warn us. They encoded their experience in myths and monuments. They preserved what lessons they could. Now we're rediscovering and decoding their messages. What we do with those messages will determine whether their effort was worthwhile. Whether we learn from their experience or repeat it. Whether we prepare or remain complacent. The choice is ours. The lesson is available. The question is whether we'll heed it. Time passes differently for civilizations than for individuals. An individual human life is measured in decades. A civilization's life is measured in centuries or millennia. The Younger Dryas survivors understood this. They built for timescales longer than individual lifetimes. They preserved knowledge meant to span generations. They thought in terms of deep time. This perspective is difficult for us. We live in an era of rapid change, where technologies become obsolete within years, where social norms shift within decades. Planning even 20 years ahead seems difficult. Planning for centuries seems impossible. Yet it's necessary. The threats we face operate on long timescales. Cosmic impacts are rare on human scales but inevitable on cosmic scales. Climate changes gradually over decades and centuries. Geological processes unfold across millennia. If we're to address these threats, we must think in correspondingly long terms. The Younger Dryas survivors managed this despite having shorter individual lifespans and fewer resources than we do. They created monuments meant to last millennia. They developed oral traditions designed to transmit knowledge across dozens of generations. They thought about the future in ways that shame our present-focused culture. Part of why they could do this is precisely because they'd experienced catastrophe. They understood viscerally that the future mattered, that preparing descendants was essential, that knowledge preservation could mean the difference between survival and extinction. Their catastrophe gave them perspective we lack. We haven't experienced comparable catastrophe, at least not in recorded history, not globally. Local disasters happen, regions are devastated, but humanity as a whole hasn't faced extinction-level threats within memory. This creates dangerous complacency. We assume that because we haven't experienced such threats, they must not be real or must be extremely unlikely. But the geological record says otherwise. It says catastrophes happen regularly on cosmic timescales, even if rarely on human timescales. It says Earth has been struck many times by objects large enough to cause global devastation. It says the Younger Dryas impacts are just the most recent example we have clear evidence for. The message is clear. We're not exempt from cosmic threats because we have modern technology. We're still vulnerable. The difference is that we have capabilities to detect and possibly prevent impacts that previous civilizations lacked. But those capabilities only help if we use them. This requires long-term investment in space monitoring, in deflection technology development, in resilient infrastructure. It requires international cooperation. Cosmic threats don't respect national boundaries. It requires thinking beyond electoral cycles and quarterly reports to plan across decades and centuries. Can we do this? Can modern civilizations, with their short attention spans and competing priorities, manage the long-term thinking and cooperation necessary to address cosmic threats? The Younger Dryas survivors would probably be skeptical. They'd see our obsession with immediate concerns, our neglect of long-term threats, our failure to preserve knowledge in resilient formats. They'd recognize the pattern, the complacency that comes from not having experienced catastrophe, the assumption that because something hasn't happened recently it won't happen at all. They'd also recognize our capabilities. They'd see that we have tools they could barely imagine, telescopes to see threats coming from millions of miles away, rockets that could potentially intercept and deflect incoming objects, communication systems that can coordinate global responses. They'd see that we have potential to do what they couldn't, not just survive catastrophe but prevent it. Whether we fulfill that potential is another question. Potential means nothing without action. We must choose to use our capabilities, to invest in preparation, to think long-term despite short-term pressures. The evidence that we're making these choices is mixed. Some nations and organizations take cosmic threats seriously, fund monitoring programs, research deflection technologies. Others dismiss the risk as too remote to warrant investment. Overall, our effort is inadequate to the scale of the threat. This could change. Awareness is growing. The scientific evidence for the Younger Dryas impacts is becoming mainstream. Popular understanding of cosmic threats is improving. Political interest in planetary defense is increasing. But awareness isn't enough. It must translate into action, sustained, adequate funding for monitoring and deflection programs, international agreements on cooperation and response protocols, integration of cosmic threat preparedness into broader disaster planning. These are achievable goals. They don't require impossible technologies or unsustainable resources. They require only will and coordination, exactly what the Younger Dryas survivors demonstrated when they rebuilt civilization from scattered remnants. If they could rebuild from catastrophe with Stone Age tools and limited populations, we can prepare to prevent catastrophe with modern technology and global populations. We have every advantage except perhaps their hard-won wisdom about impermanence and vulnerability. But we can gain that wisdom by learning from their experience, by studying what happened to them, by recognizing that their catastrophe is not ancient history irrelevant to our time, but a warning that remains urgent today. This is why the Younger Dryas period deserves attention beyond academic circles. Why it should be taught widely, discussed publicly, integrated into our cultural understanding. Not to create fear, but to create awareness. Not to inspire despair, but to motivate preparation. The survivors left us messages. They told us what happened. They showed us it was survivable but devastating. They demonstrated that knowledge can be preserved and civilization rebuilt. And they warned us that it could happen again. We've received the message. We understand it better than any generation since the catastrophe. We have tools to address the threat they couldn't address. The question is whether we'll act on what we know. That question will be answered by our choices over the coming decades. By whether we invest adequately in space monitoring and planetary defense. By whether we build resilience into our systems. By whether we preserve knowledge in forms that could survive disruption. By whether we think long-term despite short-term pressures. The Younger Dryas survivors would watch these choices with interest. They'd recognize the familiar dynamic. A civilization comfortable enough to feel secure, advanced enough to have options, but uncertain whether it will choose wisely. They'd see the potential for preparation but also the temptation of complacency. They couldn't advise us directly. They died millennia ago. But they left their advice encoded in monuments and myths, preserved in stone and story. That advice is simple. Remember what happened, understand the threat, prepare while you can, don't assume you're exempt from the dangers they faced. It's good advice. Whether we take it will determine not just our fate but our descendants' fate, not just for years or decades but potentially for millennia. Because if we prepare and prevent the next catastrophe, civilization can continue uninterrupted, knowledge can accumulate, progress can continue. But if we fail to prepare and catastrophe strikes, we'll face what the Younger Dryas survivors faced: devastation, loss, the need to rebuild from fragments. We can do better. We should do better. We owe it to them, to ourselves, to our descendants. The story of the Younger Dryas period is ultimately a story about memory and forgetting. The survivors remembered they had to, it was too traumatic to forget. They encoded their memories in every format available. Oral tradition, ritual practice, monumental architecture. They made remembering a sacred duty. But over millennia, despite their best efforts, the clear memory degraded. Stories became myths. Historical accounts became religious narratives. Specific warnings about cosmic threats became generalized anxieties about divine punishment. The details were lost even as the emotional core remained. This is the tragedy of knowledge loss. Not sudden destruction, but slow erosion. Each generation transmits slightly less than it received, understanding slightly less of the context, preserving the form but losing the function. Eventually, the original meaning is lost entirely, leaving only the residue, the myth, the ritual, the monument whose purpose is forgotten. We're experiencing this process with our own history. The Younger Dryas survivors tried to warn us. They succeeded in preserving the warning for thousands of years. But by the time we rediscovered their monuments and decoded their messages, we'd forgotten why they mattered. We treated them as archaeological curiosities rather than urgent warnings. Now we're remembering. We're reconstructing what they knew. We're beginning to understand what they tried to tell us. This is a kind of cultural reawakening, a recovery of lost knowledge. But this recovery is fragile. It depends on continued research, on public interest, on institutional support for investigating these questions. If attention wanes, if funding dries up, if other priorities dominate, the knowledge could be lost again. The lesson could be forgotten again. The warnings could be dismissed again. This makes the current moment critical. We're in a window where the evidence is being discovered, the connections are being made, the implications are being understood. This window might not remain open indefinitely. Scientific fashions change. Research priorities shift. What seems important now might seem irrelevant in a generation. We need to ensure the lesson is preserved while it's available. We need to integrate the Younger Dryas narrative into our cultural understanding firmly enough that it won't be forgotten again. We need to institutionalize the response, make space monitoring and planetary defense permanent, adequately funded priorities rather than temporary programs subject to budget cuts. This is how knowledge survives across generations. Not through individual memory, which dies with individuals, but through institutional commitment, through cultural integration, through building knowledge into the permanent structures of society. The Younger Dryas survivors understood this. They didn't rely on individual memory. They knew individuals die and memories die with them. They created monuments, physical structures that would outlast any individual or generation. They created rituals, repetitive practices that would be transmitted even if understanding was lost. They created myths, stories engaging enough to be repeated even by people who didn't understand their true meaning. These methods worked. The monuments stand. The myths survive. The rituals continued for thousands of years. Across that vast span of time, the essential message was preserved, even if the details were lost. We have better methods now. We have writing, which fixes knowledge more reliably than oral tradition. We have institutions designed specifically to preserve and transmit knowledge. We have technology that can store information in multiple redundant formats. But we also have vulnerabilities they didn't have. Our knowledge is increasingly dependent on complex technologies that might not survive societal disruption. Much of our information exists only in digital formats that require specific hardware and software to access. Our institutions, while powerful, are also specialized and interdependent in ways that make them fragile. If our civilization experienced disruption comparable to what the Younger Dryas impacts caused, if electrical grids failed, if supply chains collapsed, if institutions dissolved, how much of our knowledge would survive? How much of our digital information could be recovered without computers to read it? How much of our specialized expertise would persist without universities to teach it? Probably more than survived the Younger Dryas catastrophe. We have larger populations, more redundancy, better storage methods. But also probably less than we'd like to believe. We've optimized for efficiency and convenience rather than resilience. We've centralized knowledge rather than distributing it widely. We've specialized to the point where few individuals understand complete systems. This is a vulnerability, not necessarily a fatal one, but a vulnerability nonetheless. One that becomes relevant when thinking about long-term knowledge preservation and civilizational resilience. The Younger Dryas survivors, working with Stone Age technology, created knowledge preservation systems that succeeded across 12,000 years. We, with far better technology, should be able to do at least as well. But we need to think consciously about resilience, about redundancy, about preserving knowledge in formats that could survive various catastrophe scenarios. This means maintaining physical libraries alongside digital databases. It means preserving practical skills alongside theoretical knowledge. It means distributing expertise widely rather than concentrating it. It means teaching general principles that can be applied in various contexts, not just specialized techniques that only work with specific technologies. It means, in short, learning from the Younger Dryas survivors' example. They didn't have our advantages, but they understood some things we've forgotten. That knowledge is fragile, that civilizations can fall, that preparing for the worst while hoping for the best is wisdom rather than pessimism. Their legacy is available to us if we choose to receive it. The monuments they built speak to us across millennia. The myths they preserved encode their experiences. The evidence in geological and archaeological records reveals what happened to them. All the pieces are there for us to learn from their catastrophe and apply those lessons to our own time. Whether we learn is up to us. Whether we remember is our choice. Whether we prepare or remain complacent will be determined by decisions we make over the coming years and decades. The Younger Dryas survivors did their part. They survived. They preserved knowledge. They rebuilt civilization. They left warnings for future generations. They fulfilled their responsibility to their descendants, to us. Now the responsibility is ours. To learn from their experience. To heed their warnings. To prepare for threats they couldn't prevent. To build resilience they could only dream of. To think long-term as they did. To remember rather than forget. This is how we honor their effort. Not by romanticizing the past, not by building more monuments to dead civilizations, but by learning the lessons they tried to teach and applying them to our own challenges. The cosmic threat that struck them remains. The civilizational fragility they experienced hasn't disappeared. The knowledge preservation challenges they faced are still relevant. The need for long-term thinking and planning is as urgent now as it was then. But we have advantages. We understand the threats better. We have capabilities they lacked. We can potentially prevent what they could only survive. Whether we use those advantages wisely will determine not just our own fate but the fate of all who come after us, just as the Younger Dryas survivors' choices determined ours. The night sky looks different when you understand what's out there. Not just stars and planets, but rocks. Vast numbers of rocks, ranging from pebbles to mountains, orbiting the sun, occasionally crossing Earth's path. Most are harmless, too small to survive atmospheric entry or causing only spectacular meteor displays. But some are larger. Some could devastate regions or continents. A few could threaten civilization itself. The Younger Dryas survivors watched the sky differently after their catastrophe. To them, the sky wasn't just beautiful or mysterious. It was threatening, the realm from which destruction had come. Their astronomical observations weren't just scientific curiosity or agricultural necessity. They were surveillance, watching for the next threat, trying to understand patterns that might predict when danger would come again. We've lost that vigilance. We look at the sky with wonder or take it for granted, but we don't watch it with the wariness of people who know what can fall from it. We track some near-Earth objects, but our monitoring is incomplete. We've begun developing deflection concepts, but none are fully operational. We're better prepared than any previous civilization, but still woefully underprepared for the scale of threat that the Younger Dryas impacts represented. This could change. The technology exists or could be developed. International cooperation is possible. Adequate preparation is achievable. What's lacking is sufficient motivation, the sense of urgency that comes from understanding that the threat is real, not hypothetical. The Younger Dryas survivors had that urgency. They'd experienced the catastrophe. They knew the threat was real. They couldn't prevent it, but they could warn their descendants, could preserve the knowledge that cosmic impacts happen and civilization must be ready. Their warning reaches us now, 12,000 years later. We're receiving the message they tried so hard to preserve. The question is whether we'll act on it or dismiss it as ancient history with no contemporary relevance. The stakes are higher than they were for the Younger Dryas survivors. Our population is vastly larger, nearly 8 billion people compared to perhaps a few million then. Civilization is more complex, more interdependent, more vulnerable to cascading failures. An impact that the ancient survivors endured and recovered from might devastate us more thoroughly because we've built a world optimized for stability rather than resilience. But we also have more capabilities. We can see threats coming. We can potentially deflect them. We can preserve knowledge more reliably. We can recover more quickly if prevention fails. Whether our greater capabilities outweigh our greater vulnerabilities depends on whether we use those capabilities wisely. This is the lesson of the Younger Dryas period. Not that catastrophe is inevitable or that civilization is doomed, but that threats are real and preparation matters. That vulnerability and resilience both exist. That human choices determine which predominates. The survivors made their choices. They chose to preserve knowledge despite devastating losses. They chose to rebuild despite overwhelming challenges. They chose to warn future generations despite knowing they might never hear the warning. Their choices enabled our existence. We're here because they survived, because they preserved enough knowledge to restart civilization, because they didn't give up despite facing what must have seemed like the end of the world. Now we face our own choices. Not identical to theirs, our situation is different, our capabilities greater, our threats more varied. But similar in essential ways. Will we prepare for catastrophes we hope won't occur? Will we preserve knowledge for descendants we'll never meet? Will we think long-term despite short-term pressures? These aren't easy choices. Preparation is expensive. Long-term thinking is difficult. Warnings about future threats compete with urgent present needs. It's easier to focus on immediate problems than distant possibilities. But the Younger Dryas survivors show that long-term thinking is possible even in desperate circumstances. If they could plan for futures they wouldn't see while struggling to survive in a devastated world, we can certainly do so while living in relative comfort and abundance. This is a matter of perspective and priority. Do we see ourselves as isolated individuals concerned only with immediate circumstances? Or as links in a chain connecting past to future, responsible for preserving what we've received and passing it forward improved? The Younger Dryas survivors saw themselves as links. They understood they were inheritors of knowledge from the before time. They understood they had responsibility to preserve and transmit that knowledge. They understood their actions would affect not just themselves but generations extending far into the future. This is the perspective we need, not just for cosmic threat preparation, but for all long-term challenges. Climate change, resource depletion, technological risks, all require thinking beyond individual lifetimes, planning for descendants, making sacrifices now for benefits that won't be realized for decades or centuries. Can modern civilization adopt this perspective? Can we think like links in a chain rather than isolated individuals? Can we make choices that benefit the distant future even at some cost to the immediate present? The Younger Dryas survivors would say we must. Not as moral imperative but as practical necessity. Civilizations that don't prepare for long-term threats don't survive those threats. Knowledge that isn't actively preserved is eventually lost. Responsibilities that aren't accepted aren't fulfilled. This is realism, not idealism. It's acknowledging how civilizations actually work, how knowledge is actually transmitted, how survival is actually achieved across the vast spans of time that separate one generation from another. The evidence from the Younger Dryas period makes this clear. Civilizations are fragile. Knowledge can be lost. Catastrophes do occur. But also, humans are resilient, recovery is possible, preparation makes a difference. Both parts of this message matter. The first prevents complacency. The second prevents despair. Together, they provide a balanced perspective. Sober about risks, but confident about capabilities. This is the wisdom the survivors left us. Not just a warning about cosmic threats, but a broader lesson about civilizational resilience, about the importance of preparation and memory, about the long view that sees beyond individual lifetimes to the continuation of humanity across deep time. We're receiving this wisdom now. We're understanding what they tried to tell us. We're rediscovering what they knew. The question is whether we'll apply it. The answer will come through our actions over the coming decades. Through the choices we make about funding, about priorities, about what we preserve and what we neglect. Through whether we build for resilience or just efficiency. Through whether we think generations ahead or just years ahead. The Younger Dryas survivors are watching, in a sense. Not literally, they're long dead, but their legacy watches. Their monuments stand. Their warnings wait. Their question echoes across millennia. Will you learn? Will you prepare? Will you remember? Our answer will be written not in words but in actions. Not in promises but in actual preparation. Not in good intentions but in effective response to the lessons their catastrophe taught. Time will tell what that answer is. But time doesn't wait. The cosmic threats that struck them still orbit. The vulnerability they experienced we still share. The resilience they demonstrated we must match or exceed. The story of the Younger Dryas period is still being written. Not the ancient part that's fixed in stone and sediment in myths and monuments. But the modern part, our part, is still unfolding. We're in the middle of the story, at the point where the descendants of the survivors finally understand what happened to their ancestors and must decide how to respond. This is a privileged position. We have perspective the survivors lacked. We can see the full scope of what happened to them, can understand the cosmic mechanics that caused the catastrophe, can recognize the patterns in how civilization fell and recovered. We have knowledge they desperately sought but couldn't fully achieve. But knowledge without action is just interesting information. What matters is what we do with understanding. Whether we apply the lessons or simply file them away as historical curiosities. The Younger Dryas survivors couldn't save themselves. The catastrophe struck too suddenly. But they could save us, in a sense, by warning us, by preserving the knowledge that such events occur, by demonstrating that recovery is possible if knowledge survives. They did that. They succeeded in their mission across 12,000 years. The warning reached us. We've decoded it. We understand it. Now it's our turn. Our mission is different but related, to prepare so that if catastrophe threatens, it can be prevented or at least survived more successfully than they managed. To preserve knowledge more reliably than they could. To think as long-term as they did. To fulfill our responsibility to our descendants as they fulfilled theirs to us. This is the continuing story of human civilization. Not a straight line of progress, but a complex narrative of rise and fall, of knowledge gained and lost and regained, of catastrophes survived and lessons learned and warnings passed forward. The Younger Dryas period is a chapter in that story. A critical chapter, because it shows both vulnerability and resilience, both catastrophe and recovery. It shows what can be lost and what can be preserved. It shows the importance of memory and the danger of forgetting. We're writing the next chapter now. The chapter where humanity, having finally understood what happened to its ancestors, decides whether to heed their warnings or ignore them, whether to prepare or remain complacent, whether to think long-term or focus only on the immediate. What that chapter will say depends on us, on the choices we make, on the priorities we set, on whether we have the wisdom to learn from history even when that history is uncomfortable and challenging. The Younger Dryas survivors did their part. They survived the unsurvivable. They preserved the unpreservable. They warned across the unbridgeable span of millennia. They fulfilled their duty to us. Now we must fulfill ours to them and to our descendants. By remembering, by preparing, by building resilience, by thinking in the deep time perspectives they exemplified. The cosmos remains dangerous. Rocks still fall from space. Catastrophes still occur. The threats that struck them still threaten us. But we have knowledge. We have capabilities. We have warning. Whether we use these advantages will determine whether future generations look back on us as wise ancestors who prepared well, or as a cautionary tale of a civilization that knew what could happen and failed to act. The choice is ours. The Younger Dryas survivors made their choice. They chose survival, knowledge preservation, and future orientation despite facing devastation we can barely imagine. What will we choose? The answer isn't yet written. It's being written now, in our actions and inactions, in our decisions and defaults. The survivors watch, across time, waiting to see if their effort to warn us was worthwhile, if we learned their lesson, if we'll prove ourselves worthy descendants of those who survived the fire from the sky and rebuilt civilization from ashes. The ice cores preserve the evidence. The monuments stand witness. The myths echo their warning. Listen, can you hear what they're trying to tell us? The sky remembers. The earth remembers. The stones remember. Do we?